The time has come. The sequel is upon us. Now is the time that we determine, does this sequel fall down to the depths of the dark space, a ruinous event upon which has graced this series? Or does it rise? Does it elevate what has come before? Does it provide great follow-ups and great context for future events? That is always the question with sequels. Is it worse? Or is it an ascension of what came before? Hey there everyone, Afrodo Reviews here, bringing you another book to determine, is that book worth reading over second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? So let's decide. Today's book is Mass Effect Ascension. Mass Effect Ascension is a Mass Effect Expanded Universe novel that was published on July 29, 2008. Written by Karpyshyn and a direct sequel to the previous book, one I've reviewed on my own channel, Mass Effect Revelations, as well as being a semi-soft sequel to Mass Effect 1. Though the book does not deal with anything that happened within Mass Effect 1, so like I said, it's a very soft sequel. It's a sequel only in the sense that it's a story that came directly after the events of the game. The reception I could find for this book is as follows. For anyone who follows the Mass Effect games, there's actually a fair amount of trivia behind this book that I like to share. For example, this is the first known appearance of both the Elusive Man and the first mention of the Collectors within the universe, both of which became major players within Mass Effect 2, which would come out not exactly, but 1.5 years later. So, that's actually kind of interesting knowing that Karpyshyn, who was one of the lead writers in Mass Effect 1 and 2, actually had a fair idea of where he was going even 1.5 years before the game came out. Although I don't know very much about game development, so it's entirely possible by then the story was already written and they were focusing on animating everything. Although based on what I've heard, by the time Karpyshyn left the project, there was still story changes that were made, specifically involving Legion. This isn't something I should get into, though. This is about the book, not about the game. So, if you're interested, you should look that up. It's kind of funny. So, before I get too caught up on discussing with the Mass Effect lore, of which I can speak for hours on, so don't test me, let's move on to the book, or the review itself. And where should we start? Well, where we always do. The cover. Now, the cover of Mass Effect Ascension is actually good, compared to at least the previous cover of Revelation. As I recall mentioning, it's been a bit, but I remember mentioning in the first one that it was kind of bland, considering it was just Saren standing on a blank background. It didn't really tell you anything about the book. Thankfully, this book is a much better one. You got three human figures here running into a blinding light that silhouettes them. However, you can see that, now obviously this one is going to be Kaylee Sanders. This one is probably Gillian Grayson, and that's her father, Paul. There's even a nice bit of symbolism in how they're running. See, both of them have a hand on Gillian and seem to be pulling her in a different direction, symbolizing the struggle between the two to steer Gillian down the right path. Now, Kaylee has 2 hands, indicating she's pulling much harder, whereas Paul only has 1 hand and doesn't seem to be pulling very hard. Both indicative of their approach in the book. Standing over them in the background is, at first, to be honest, I thought this was a Geth sitting in the background. So before I read the synopsis back in the day, I thought this actually had to do with Geth again. But no, it's actually a Quarian. As you can see, it's got a little, filtration pump there, and it's got the hood. Now, this is my one slight complaint about this cover, mostly because on a first glance, it very much looks like a Geth. And while I do like that it actually showed me how similar the Quarian and the Geth are in design that you otherwise wouldn't notice. It is very easy to mistake because the top part of the head is cut off. These streaks for the hood can be easily mistaken for light coming from the door, since they both since one does flat out connect to the light and the other comes very close. It's only really when you notice this little pipe here that you're like, oh wait, that's a Quarian, not a Geth. So yeah, that's the one complaint I have about this front cover. The back, however, is still kind of bland. Now, I obviously have the mass market paperback edition, so it might be better on a different edition, but I don't know. I'm going to review it based on this. It's just a black background with the synopsis, which I read in my TBR if you haven't already watched that. Link up there like always. That does do something somewhat interesting in that it makes that little beginning blurb of the synopsis, one that's in almost every Mass Effect, red as opposed to white. But apart from that, there's really nothing else going on back here. It's not very interesting, but it does do its job. And unlike Revelation, it actually does tell you quite a bit about the story, as opposed to sort of feeling like they were given spark notes and just made up their own story. Now, let's move on to the synopsis. Again, for those curious, I read it in my TBR. Check it out there. I may have also published a short by now, but I haven't decided as of recording. So, mind you, I'm still trying to figure out how to work the border thing to make what I record on this a short, as opposed to just what I'm recording on my phone. But that's neither here nor there. So, the story is about... Well, the story specifically... It's based on this one line Tali Zora says in Mass Effect 2 when you ask her why Quarians hate Cerberus so much.
They attacked one of our ships, the Idena. It seems they were attempting to kill or control a young human biotic who was on the fleet. I don't really know the details. I do know that Cerberus made an enemy of the Quarian people.
Oh, well, technically speaking, it is that's a reference to this book, since this came out a year and a half earlier. It's not so much them providing context, so much as them referencing what happened for the novel audience. For the people who've read the novel, like, oh!
I understood that reference.
But this book basically follows Kaylee Sanders, a semi-protagonist from the first book, as she starts as a teacher within the Ascension Project, where they teach human biotics. For those of you who aren't into the Mass Effect world, biotics are effectively space magic. I'm just going to say space magic because although it kind of sometimes fits mostly with psychics, it's space magic. So yeah, it lets you do this kind of stuff. With that, basically, Kaylee Sanders is teaching at the Ascension Project. One of the most promising students is a autistic girl named Gillian Grayson. She has high-functioning autism. The back says borderline, but based on how the book writes it, she does have autism. It's high-functioning. Anyways, while they're teaching her, Kaylee discovers that one of the professors that she was close with is actually a Cerberus scientist who's been experimenting on Kaylee. And for those of you who played Mass Effect 2, you know that, yeah, Cerberus is no stranger to experimenting on children with biotics. So, in that panic, her father, Paul Grayson, who is a Red Sand addict, comes to pick her up and take her out of the school, seemingly for her own safety. Kaylee, unwilling to let Gillian go with Paul, figuring out that he's an addict and just being generally suspicious of him, decides to go along with a character who isn't mentioned in the synopsis named Hindle Mitra. I think that's how you pronounce it. It's going to be down here. And they basically go into the Terminus systems. But what Hindle and Kaylee don't know yet is that Paul Grayson is actually a operative of Cerberus. And this was a ploy to try to get his daughter to the organization's hand after they discovered the mole. And from there, I'm going to stop speaking because the rest kind of dips into spoiler territory. I only kind of talked about the stuff that is flat out revealed in the synopsis. So, what did I like about this book? Well, for one, it actually has fairly decent representation for something written in 2008. Not only is Gillian Grayson an autistic person whose autism, one, isn't portrayed as a superpower like it's often done in bad works. And there seems to be a specific kind of care taken to make sure they represent it right without going... to represent it right, basically. Then you have Hindomitra, who is a gay man who is just a character. He's not put in there simply because they needed a gay romance. He's not put in there simply because we're gonna kill the gay. No, in fact, Hindomitra exists first as a character who happens to be gay. And I love that for 2008. Mind you, this is 2008 that I'm talking about. While LGBT rights was in the swing, they really had not reached a very big moment yet. Follow this up with a slight disclaimer. Obviously, I am neither gay or autistic, as far as I know. As far as I can tell, Karpyshyn was actually doing his best to represent both people as people first, and not their representation, is a good way of putting it. The book also does exactly what I think an expanded universe novel should do. Now, I've talked about this before in the past, but one of the things that I think expanded universe novels should do, for the most part, it gets kind of tricky when you get into something like Star Wars, which is its own universe in expanded universe, especially now that Disney decanonized it. But with things like Mass Effect or, say, Dead Space or things like that get novels, I think one of the things that expanded universe novels should do is expand upon the source material in such a way that if I were to go back and play the game, I have a bigger appreciation for the lore and world behind it. And this does exactly that. Not only do you learn more things about the Ascension project, Kaylee Sanders, who pops up in 3, just more about just the background of the world, especially Quarian culture, which... But anyways, it expands upon all those things in such a way that I appreciate it more when I go back into Mass Effect 2 and play through. Even a couple things in Mass Effect 1 as well. Like I said, it really enhances the experience on a replay through the games. But just because it enhances the experience doesn't mean you can't also read it on its own. Like the first book, there's a clearly careful attention paid to make sure that people reading this don't necessarily have to be fans of the game to enjoy it. Now, I've only really had one big expanded universe novel that's had this issue real bad. That was Doctor Who's Only Human, where it was clear that whoever wrote that did not care if you did not like did not care if you were not already in the fandom of Doctor Who. So, as far as they were concerned, you were reading this as a fan and nothing else. I mean, and based on the score I gave it, I mean, I guess that's not entirely wrong. But that being said, you can just pick this book up without having played any of the games. And the only thing I would recommend is reading the first book, but even then, I'm fairly sure this book would work fine as a standalone book. You don't need to read the first one to really understand what's going on in this one. You'll just appreciate it more if you did read the first one, is a good way. You'll be appreciating the characters more if you read the first one. That's a way to put it. Unfortunately, though, even with good books, there is generally something that I have to comment on of what I didn't like. Now, I'm going to follow this up with a slight preface before I get into them. Most of my issues with this book are admittedly closer to nitpicks than big giant flaws, like in some of the books I really dislike. Trust me, you're going to see some of that. But in this case, most of them are just nitpicks, and they're probably something that you yourself may not have an issue with when you get into it. Apart from one, I would argue, everything else is closer to just take it as, this is more my personal opinion than something I could argue from an objective viewpoint, I guess. Let's start. The biggest problem with this book, it feels overwritten. So this is the first... This book is kind of telling its own story. I mean, compared to the first one, which came out 7 months before Mass Effect 1, but I've kind of felt like it knew that no one would really be super interested in it until they picked up Mass Effect 1 and like, wow, that's really good. They kind of already had a plan. This was Anderson's story, and they kind of knew what they were going to do with that. It was going to tie directly into the first game. This one is a book that stands completely by itself. You don't need to read it to get a character's backstory. This is a story that exists within the Mass Effect world, but doesn't directly relate to the Mass Effect games, like Anderson's story does, or the following story will. That being said, because of that, it feels like Karpyshyn kind of overwrote as compensation. The first half is definitely very slow in the sense that it just feels like it's dragging at times, due to the fact that I feel like Karpyshyn was worried that it would not be able to stand, considering that the game release was a year and a half away, and I don't know if the game was rushed or not. There's always that factor to consider. It might have also been delayed, so who knows. In addition, one of the things that this book does that I felt kinda ruined some of the experience was it felt the need to repeat things to the point that it came off as ad nauseum. Now, obviously, some repetition is needed within writing. I know I make this complaint a lot about a lot of books and how often it repeats stuff. Repetition is important to writing so you can sear stuff into your reader's brain. That being said, things like this, Mass Effect Ascension, sort of just repeat stuff that aren't that important. One example is Hindle's sexuality. Now, I did praise it for having Hindle as a gay man without feeling the need to make that his entire personality. That being said, when the first part of the book feels the need to constantly remind you that he is a gay man. People are constantly saying, well, Kaylee is assuring someone that she's seeing that, oh, don't worry, Hindle's more interested in you than me, kind of thing. And, it just keeps coming up that Hindle's gay, Hindle's gay, Hindle's gay, Hindle's gay, Hindle's gay. It just gets, you notice how on like that third time I said that, you're just like, okay, shut up, move on. That's kind of how it feels when you're reading this book and you get little sections like that. It's not the only one, but that's the one that stands out most in my mind. Another issue that's also sort of in Revelation that I don't remember talking about was that the writing is kind of... What's the right way to put it? The dialogue is a little clunky, and it feels a little Pulp Fiction-y in some places. It's not a problem throughout the whole book. It's just one of those... In the first one, it was forgivable because that was written before any of the universe came out, so it felt like it was trying to introduce us to this universe more than anything. So you definitely forgave it a little more. But this being the second time I read the book, and this being the second book in a series that's had both a game and a first novel, it's a little less forgivable for me. That being said, most of you who pick it up might also just be able to easily ignore it. So, again, mind you, nitpick at best. But other than that, that's really all I have to say about this book. So, at the end of the day, I'd give it a 7 out of 10. Yeah, it's a 7 out of 10 that's above the first book, when we get past the first act, which is very slow. However, I don't think it was quite good enough to get to 8. It got close, but it wasn't quite there. Personally, I would recommend this book to anyone who's a big fan of Mass Effect, or anyone kind of looking for a pulpy sci-fi book. As I said, you don't really need to read the first one to understand this, but I would recommend it because I think you'll appreciate at least Kaylee Sanders as a character a little better, having understand what she went through in the previous entry. And there are some things from the first book that is mildly important for this one, but at the same time not terribly, because the book does explain it a little. But yeah, I think if you fit those criteria, you'll be doing yourself a favor by picking this up and reading it. But for now, we must look towards the future, and the future looks grim, as I see a typhoon approaching. But just remember, with every book comes an adventure, and every adventure is worth having, even the bad one.